Professor Derek H. Alderman of the University of Tennessee, Knoxville writes, quote, "The relationship between African Americans and tourism is a complex and conflicted one, given the highly discriminatory history of hospitality in the United States and the inequalities that still characterize the industry. However, African American tourists are an increasingly important and profitable segment of the travel market. Yet the African American experience remains underanalyzed by scholars and is often downplayed by tour guides. When examining the tourism industry, both inside and outside the United States, it is clear the industry has traditionally, quote, adopted a white male gaze that obscures the experiences of racial and ethnic minorities while perpetuating racist stereotypes. Travel marketeers engage in a social sorting of visitors in terms of defining who is most culturally acceptable, and the portrayal of non-whites is still limited and highly constrained in the tourism advertisement. There is evidence that some U.S. tourism promoters continue to perpetuate an invisibility of African Americans in their advertisements and trivialize the struggles of the Black community at heritage tourism sites such as George Washington's home here in Philadelphia or plantation tours throughout the southern United States. On a recent tour of a plantation home in New Orleans, a tour guide answered a person's question about slave life by saying, "I don't know what the problem was. They were being fed and clothed, so it couldn't have been that bad." I had to politely inform him that trivializing questions about the slave populations living on the property minimized their history and importance to the site. Tourism shapes and is shaped by broader racial inequalities, producing an uneven cultural distribution of citizenship for African Americans that clearly limits their identity as historical figures, legitimate members of host communities, and as welcome visitors. However, tourism, especially at historical sites where there was an African American presence, holds promise for African American entrepreneurs and scholars because it allows them to practice Ujamaa and Kujichagulia. Habari Gani, what's the news? The news is telling our tales, the Underground Railroad, the Johnson House, and African American tourism. Welcome. I'm Dr. Ardencia Hall Karambe, and this is The Market. In our last episode, we had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Jacqueline Akins about the history of the Underground Railroad, and especially its connection with places and spaces in Philadelphia like Mother Bethel AME Church. While preparing for that talk, it became very clear that there was another aspect of that story, a more modern one that needed to be told. Places like Mother Bethel and the Johnson House in Germantown still exist and can offer insight into the lives of early African Americans, but they are often not included as part of the historical tours offered by the city. These gaps in telling American history make that history one-sided and misleading. For African Americans going on these tours, they are often left wondering, where were the Black folks? I know they were here. But it also does a disservice to the other visitors who expect the tour guides to tell the full story of the site. By telling our own tales, African American scholars and entrepreneurs have the opportunity to fill those gaps and reveal a richer textured history while practicing Kujichagulia, self-determination, and Ujamaa, or cooperative economics. Today, my guest, Jacqueline Wiggins, and I will discuss some of the possibilities of this subject. Professor Wiggins is an adjunct here in the English department at Community College of Philadelphia, a former teacher for the Philadelphia Independent School District, and founder of the Heritage Tourism Program. Welcome, Jackie. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
A pleasure, girl. It's good to see you. I was recently had the opportunity to go on a tour to Johnson House in Germantown, and I found it to be extremely exciting. It was like stepping back in time and getting a glimpse of what life was like for people who lived back then. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the Johnson House, its place in the Underground Railroad history, and that connection. And how did you get started with the Johnson House?
Well, wonder of wonders, my involvement with the Johnson House came from a short stint with the African American Museum in Philadelphia, then to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which had a heritage tourism program. And from that, it sort of segued into an opportunity at the Johnson House. I started there as their site administrator in, let's say, January of '98, and I was asked to conduct tours. It was new to me, but also what was new to me was the depth of the story of the Underground Railroad. Fortunately, there were people in place that we've had, and some are still here. For example, Mr. Charles Blockson is still with us. He's the foremost bibliophile of African American history, particularly with the Underground Railroad. And Dr. Shirley Turpin Parham, who was a teacher with the School District of Philadelphia. She transitioned. However, she was a force with respect to training teachers with the entire history of the African American experience. So I had those assist in terms of trying to run the tours, try to understand the history. And I'm telling you, it was something to learn. The Johnson House, in and of itself, is an intact Underground Railroad National Historic Landmark, if you will. That's one of the highest designations to the Department of the Interior through the National Park Service here in the city. It's intact because it was built, well, the large part of the house was finished in 1768. It took about the second generation to become those abolitionists, to become those white Quakers who involved themselves, took their lives in jeopardy, if you will, to help enslaved Africans who were on the run and who were seeking freedom. So that house stood for many, many years, people just walking by, not knowing, until 1995, when a state marker went up, and that was with the assist of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Alpha Kappa Alpha has also been involved, but it was the Deltas that really that was one of their missions, to look at historic sites and see what could be done to advance the story of the African American experience. And so in the yard of the Johnson House is this marker. The house, around the late 1840s, 1850s, served as that location for African Americans who would come, who would knock on the door, as we have one story about the house where, quote, a large black man had a note. He was invited in, and the next morning, so we know he stayed overnight, he was taken down Washington Lane, which used to be called Abington Lane, to the next station stop in Montgomery County. So really go to the end of Washington Lane and across the street, you're in Montgomery County. So even in telling that, sometimes people are like, wow, it sort of gives a visual, because then you have, the Montgomery County piece that's there. So some people always ask the question, and where do people go next? Well, we don't know where they may have gone next. A lot of folks want to say, did they go to Lucretia Mott's house? I doubt it, because people were probably looking, for enslaved Africans there. But the Johnsons who were there, some of the descendants kept some records, and that's how the house became what could be termed elevated to a point to the designation of a National Historic Landmark. Now, who are the Africans? Who are the Africans that were there? That's research that can still be conducted, if you will. We don't know. We know that there were people with the name recognition, for example, such as William Still, who was a friend of the Johnsons. He and Israel Johnson, for example, were associates with the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. So when we're looking at this particular house and its story, we're looking at a family, a white Quaker family, who, for example, refused to purchase any goods that were made from slave labor. All right, those were the Free Produce Society. Who else came to the house in terms of name recognition? Well, we have that Frederick Douglass did. We like to say that Harriet Tubman probably made a stop, but we're looking for that documentation, but Mrs. Tubman was, a very special conductor, if you will. But I can see her knocking on the door. I can see her also working her way to Lucretia Mott's house. So those are some visuals that we could put in place. This effort of the Underground Railroad are really black folks helping black folks first and foremost, and that's a part of the story that needs to be told, all right? We're looking at the Underground Railroad, which black folks initially called the Underground Roadway, then Underground Railway. And the term railroad came into greater existence as railroads themselves came into greater use. So those terms associated with railroads, agent, tickets, conductors, passengers, all those types of words came into greater use. Now some people say the Underground Railroad, 1830s, 1860s. I say something a little differently, because African people ran away all the time. They tried to run away in Africa. Why would they be in chains? All right. In the Middle Passage, we know the horror of that and what happened with respect to African people there. So when people say 1830s, 1850s, and 60s and so forth, we're really looking at the rise of anti-slavery societies. Some segregated, some integrated, and so forth. So I think sometimes history sort of takes a path that has people perhaps thinking in one direction. Black folks did not just sit there and say, it was 1830s, time to run.
Right, exactly.
You know, no.
There's no exact pinpoint. There's always bleeding before and a little bit after. Yeah.
Because the resistance was something that is the undertold story, you know, of this particular story. So the Johnson House plays a key role in telling that story, particularly in the area of Germantown, where some people feel, oh, that was abolitionists, you know, let's say a part of town. Well, yes and no. There were some folks that cared about people who were enslaved, and there's some that didn't care at all, and there's some that cared a lot, and so they told. So that's one of the stories that comes forth that we have documented. One night there was a knock on the front door. This time it was the constable or the sheriff, and there was an African family there, so I don't want to tell too much more because we want people to go to the Johnson House. But these are the stories that come forth with respect to that particular house. And
the relationship between the Johnson House and Cliveden, which is right down the right down the street. You know what I'm saying? So that's a very interesting relationship, that you had an underground railroad station right here on this corner, and 2 blocks down you had a slave plantation right down the street. So they were hiding slaves on this corner, and on the next corner they were enslaving. And so it's very just the close proximity between all of this interaction makes it very interesting. So when we're looking at the Johnson House in modern terms right now, and in bringing in tours, what do you think local tour guides, or what can African American entrepreneurs who may be interested in doing these things, how can they get into doing this? How does one become, how does one begin to tell that local, how can one find out? And because I know, for example, when I have had family come here from Texas, and they go on tour, and they go see one part, and then I have to go take them to see the other part. So, you know, so how can we integrate that a little bit more, or, you know, do you have any ideas of what we could do to try to bring?
Oh, I have a lot of ideas about
some of that together.
Well, if we can look at what does exist, for example, in our school district, we have a mandatory course in African American history. But to be quite frank, there has been tension with respect to that instruction being done in an efficient way. There are some teachers who, for example, have said to one of the staff people, the curriculum person, for example, they didn't feel comfortable teaching the African American history, and the question would be, why not? But once again, this is an issue that is a nationwide issue.
Indeed.
So at least in this town, we have that particular course. And I have observed as an adjunct here, posing questions when I have students read, for example, The Price of a Child, or have them read Jubilee, or have them read My Face is Black is True. And now we can see those that are a little bit younger coming in saying, did you take the course? Oh, yeah, I took the course. So at least you know that that was something in place. So if someone is interested in history, then they may want to begin to think about, well, how can if I feel as if I've learned something and I want to take it further as an entrepreneur, what could I do? Well, one of the things to do is that you can become a tour guide. Now, how does that happen? Well, that happens in various ways. Here in the city, I can recall being outside of Mother Bethel with my little camp that I have, and having people on tours just sort of look at Mother Bethel and say, yeah, well, that's one of the black churches. I now hear something very differently. I hear, for example, if it is one of the double-deckers, or even if it's the Ducks, that particular means of a tour, the Duck Boat Tour, I will have the guys now say a lot more. This was Richard Allen. This is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So that is improvement. So there's something that is going on in terms of the respect of the African experience here in this city. But I don't think that it's as widespread as it could be. So one way that if someone is interested in this is, number one, is to learn the history. We have here at many of the colleges regular courses, but at Temple University, through the Department of African American Studies, there's an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
There are churches all over that offer special classes and so forth. One of the things that some of the houses have done, for example, if you take the Johnson House, if you take the Paul Robeson House, if you take Mother Bethel, all right, Mother Bethel has its own guides, so they're able to tell the story from their story, from their perspective, and I love hearing it every time I do. But let's say at the Paul Robeson House and Johnson House, they have tour guide training. And now the Church of the Advocate has involved itself in that with respect to what they have to offer, you know, with the murals and so forth. So these are opportunities where you would learn, for example, I just finished with a group of 3 people who were trained at the Paul Robeson House. And Paul Robeson's father escaped enslavement from a North Carolina plantation on the Underground Railroad. And so in the family connection with that in North Carolina and the family here is one of the Underground Railroad on both sides of his family. So if people are interested, there are opportunities at some of the historic houses, such as the Johnson House, such as the Paul Robeson House, such as the Church of the Advocate, and Belmont Mansion, for example, for people to learn how to become a guide and how to get the depth with respect to the story.
Good. So what would you think would be an interesting route here in the city if someone wanted to do that? If you were giving a tour, what would you think would be some of the sites that you would think people would want to see? And how do you think, I think a lot of people think when it comes to African American tourism that the money is not there. They have this vague idea that we don't go anywhere. But you know, you know, and the power of the African American tour dollar. So can you talk about that, the possible routes, the possible places that they could go, and the dollar amount?
Well, when I've done some tours, and sometimes I've been asked, even with what was called the Greater Philadelphia Tourism Marketing Corporation, it's now called Visit Philadelphia, with some of the staff there, if it's a familiarization tour, let's say with some reporters and so forth, or if it's a family. My first stop is always Mother Bethel, because you have the church itself, you have that history, and it goes back in time, but you also have the museum that's there. That tells the story of the Underground Railroad and tells the story of Mother Bethel. After that, one of the places that I feel is another stop is, of course, the African American Museum. They have a exhibit that's there now. I don't know if its time is up just yet. It's called Audacious Freedom, where those black folks were audacious. All right, Hovey Caddo, Francis Ellen Watkins Harper, the names go on. With respect to Philadelphia being that place, even though Africans were enslaved here, you had a small but growing number of free blacks. So the African American Museum. From there, and once again, when it comes to tours, people who are going to do this have to be mindful of the age of the people who are giving tours. These are some of the little intricacies of tourism. If you have 4-hour tours, sometimes folks get a little tired. So because some things are downtown, if we stop at Reading Terminal, okay, fine, but then we go off maybe to the Paul Robeson House and then maybe to the Johnson House. Or I've taken one where we stop in Mother Bethel or the African American Museum, then I take folks out to Bristol to see this beautiful monument of Harriet Tubman right by the Delaware River, because she had family out there, all right? And then I'll take them down back through 95 and stop at Camp William Penn, then the Johnson House, then down Germantown Avenue that the native people who were here, the Lenape people, called the Great Road. It's still a great road, from Chestnut Hill all the way downtown. So in that way you see Fair Hill Cemetery, where you have Lucretia Mott is buried, where Robert Purvis is buried, and his wife Harriet Fortin Purvis, okay, one of the daughters of James Fortin, the sailmaker. Then it's a beautiful mural that the Mural Arts Program has put up of the Underground Railroad. And then you can just go right down to North Philadelphia, go, you know, down to the Church of the Advocate, maybe over to OIC, the Doll Museum, the Uptown. Oh, there is such a richness in terms of venues with respect to this. I get super excited about it because I've done it. It's not done enough. However, when people ask for tours, I do ask what the time frame would be and what we can get done, you know, within that time frame. Now, with respect to your other question about the economic impact, if you will, tourism in Philadelphia is big business. Last year, about 30-some million people came to Philadelphia, and not all just to see the bell, all right? But they came, and the amount of money that was spent for 2014 was $10.4 billion. Of which the state gets about $300-some million. the city gets over $200 million. When you're looking at African American tourism, I don't see that broken down in that way, but I do have, there is a report from the Nielsen Company that shows that it's $40 billion that African Americans spend with respect to travel and tourism. Going back to Philadelphia, Odunde, for example, pulls in at least $28 million. So I mean, you're looking at jobs, you're looking at jobs for that time frame, you're looking at economic impact. You're seeing an impact on the city that helps with everything a city needs in terms of its services.
Really, because a lot of the places that you mentioned are in places that people would normally want to go into. And I could see the opportunity of building up those communities around those sites if there was more economic connection between the sites and the entrepreneurs that live in those places.
The piece that, and this happened in February, I think. I was late to a meeting, but got to the meeting. It was about the city. And I posed the question about this money coming in for tourism. So I asked a city council person who was there, how might some of that money be turned around for the neighborhoods? Because a lot of the history of the Underground Railroad, for example, is in Philadelphia's neighborhoods. You can talk about downtown South Philadelphia, yes you do, but you need to do South Philadelphia and Frankfurt and Campbell, you know, AME Church, where there is an area where Africans were actually, you know, hidden. All right, there's North Philadelphia, there's what. This entire city is a place where routes and trails can be developed. The Uptown Development Corporation, for example, has the African American Heritage Trail program that they are, you know, it's emerging, it's moving, but it's moving too slowly because there are people who want to know about this. And I learned this when I was with the National Trust for Historic Preservation at a conference on African American tourism, where the person was conducting it. And I'm sorry, her name just escapes me right now, but she said, most of the people that come to visit, you know, the country come from Europe. They have the disposable income, you know, to do that. Not to say others can't, but they do. That's the larger number. But they don't want to come and see another European experience. They want to know, how does America work with all this mix of people? And the African American story is the story. People look at this story. They look at the struggle for freedom. They look at the struggle for rights. Black folks after enslavement want two things: the end of chattel slavery and equality. Equality is still elusive. But educating people in this informal way through tours is one way to get the job done. That's just my take on it.
I totally agree with you. So what does a person have to do? What type of educational background do they need to be able to be trained as a tour guide in this city? And is there any type of state licensing that is required?
Well, about the state licensing, that became what a controversy that became I would say a couple years ago now. What has happened is that the city wanted to do some licensing, and the only other place that I can think of where we took a group of children on a tour is Washington, D.C., where the guides have to be licensed. I think that was an idea on the part of the city, but I think the city became distracted in some way. So a group of tour guides formed the Philadelphia Tour Guide Association of Philadelphia Tour Guides, APT I think it's called. And what they decided to do was to come up with information, and I was on this little committee for a while, to develop a test to see what people would need to know so that it could look as if there would be some type of certification or knowledge. People sometimes will add things in that they may have heard through rumor and so forth, but what the guys decided to do is to look at authenticating as much as could be authenticated in a general sense about the story of America and the story of Philadelphia. So what would someone have to do? As far as I know, there's not anything that's in place right now for certification, but that particular group is one organization that could be a pathway for people to at least join, find out what's entailed, and move forward. Other groups, such as the Johnson House, Paul Robeson House, for example, would invite consultants such as myself to come in and begin to train. So one of the things that I do, in a book that I use, that if I may hold it up, is called The Good Guide. And it's a source book for interpreters, docents, and tour guides. And I just found that the writers, Allison Grinder and Sue McCoy, cover everything. They get down to the difficult visitor, they get down to racist jokes that are made, these types of things that come up, along with an educational piece around how do people learn. So for different age groups, they provide information with respect to that. So I think that if someone has an interest in history, that's key. I think you have to have that interest, and you want to have that type of thinking about what it is you're doing, you know, in terms of telling the story. If you're going to tell the story of the Underground Railroad, you're going to have to begin, I think, to rethink what you've been taught and be open to another perspective and take on the Underground Railroad. For example, sometimes folks, and I've encountered this, have difficulty when I say, for example, the Underground Railroad is black folks helping black folks first and foremost, because this was a Quaker town for a long time. And people say, what about the Quakers? And I say, well, the Quakers were involved, but you have to think. It took an African-American man, woman, family, and not willy-nilly, but thinking through and looking around, finding out how can I get this job done. Another book that I think that is just out by Dr. Cheryl LaRoche is called The Free Black Communities and Underground Railroad. And what she's done is debunk a number of myths involved with the Underground Railroad in terms of how did it happen. If you're in Texas, are you going to Canada or are you going to Mexico? Well, I think you're going to Mexico, all right? But if you're in Maryland, Virginia, or if you're in Ohio, Illinois, some of the places that she talks about, you are looking at small settlements of black people who relied on the church, who relied on fraternal organizations. These are things that I think have been the missing elements in telling this story. And Dr. LaRoche, she is a trained archaeologist. She was a part of the President's House excavation and so forth. She's on it. All right, so there are things that I think people would have to relearn. And if they're open, they will make those connections and want to make those connections with their audiences.
I want to thank my guest, Jackie Wiggins, for joining us today. It's been a delight having you here and listening to the stories of the Underground Railroad, and I hope you will come back and share some more of your wisdom with us. I also want to thank you for tuning in to CCP TV, the educational television station of Community College of Philadelphia. I'm Dr. Ardencia Hall Karambe, and this is The Market. See you next time.